Okay, let's get started. Good morning to everyone and welcome to the Symposium, Modernist Murals, held in conjunction with the Eskenazi Museum of Art's exhibition, Swing Landscape, Stuart Davis, and the Modernist Mural. This exhibition is on view at the museum through May 22nd. My name is Jenny McComas. I'm the curator of European and American art at Indiana University's Eskenazi Museum of Art. I'm also the curator for the Swing Landscape exhibition. Today, my department's graduate curatorial assistant, Marloes Krabbe, is providing some invaluable technical assistance for our Zoom-based symposium. So I want to extend a big thank you to her. Before we go on any further, you can feel free to send her questions in the chat if anything comes up that you need assistance with. So I'm so thrilled that over 165 people have registered for today's symposium. Some of you you're joining as I speak, and I hope that everyone will find their appreciation and knowledge of 20th century mural painting expanding throughout the day. I'm going to go ahead and stop this share so we can all see each other for a little bit before we get started with presentations. So I want to just talk very briefly about the concept of the exhibition. Whereas exhibitions most often concentrate on a specific artist, artistic movement, or theme, this show is built around a specific work of art, the American modernist Stuart Davis's magnificent 1938 mural, Swing Landscape. Produced under the auspices of the Works Progress Administration's Federal Art Project, or FAP, the mural was intended for installation in the Williamsburg houses in New York City, one of the nation's first federally subsidized public housing projects. However, it was ultimately not installed there, and the WPA instead allocated Swing Landscape to Indiana University in 1942. It actually arrived here just about 80 years to the day before our exhibition opened in February. So Swing Landscape has been lauded as the greatest American painting of the first half of the 20th century, thanks to its bold and innovative composition, which has been seen as pointing the way towards abstract expressionism. But its equally rich historical, social, and aesthetic contexts have been under-examined. The goal of the exhibition and of today's symposium is to enhance our understanding of this iconic work of art by illuminating its multifaceted meanings and contexts. This exhibition has been a long time in the making, not least due to its postponement from its original fall 2020 date due to the COVID pandemic. I'd like to extend my sincere gratitude to everyone who has played a role in realizing this project, including my dedicated colleagues at the Eskenazi Museum of Art and our director, David Brenneman. The staff at Yale University Press was a pleasure to work with on the production of the exhibition catalog, and I was thrilled when the publication was selected as the Outstanding Exhibition Catalog of 2020 by the Midwest Art History Society. And Marloes, if you wouldn't mind putting a link to the catalog in the chat, that would be excellent. So the exhibition has relied on the generosity of our 22 lenders who lent 37 of the 42 works on view. I'd like to extend special thanks to Earl Davis, the artist's son, for his support of the project and his generosity as a lender. And finally, the show would never have been possible without our funders and donors, including Indiana University's New Frontiers in the Arts and Humanities program, the Art Dealers Association of America Foundation, the Wyeth Foundation for American Art, the Terra Foundation for American Art, Susan Thrasher, David Jacobs, Ann Sanderson, and Paula Sunderman. And today's symposium was made possible by a grant from Indiana University's College Arts and Humanities Institute. And now just a few housekeeping notes pertinent to Zoom. Our program today consists of a virtual exhibition tour, which I'll be leading shortly. We'll then have throughout the day 4 presentations by our distinguished guests, Greta Berman, Emily S. Warner, Jody Patterson, and Harry Cooper. And we'll conclude with a panel discussion moderated by Melody Barnett-Dusner and Jeffrey Soletnik, faculty from IU's Art History Department. In the hopes of avoiding too much Zoom fatigue, we have worked several 15-minute breaks into the program throughout the day. We will also break for an hour for lunch beginning at 12:30. I know some of you are joining us from different parts of the country and different countries perhaps. So just as a reminder, all of our times are based on Eastern Daylight Time. And all the presentations will also be recorded, and those will be available in a couple of weeks. So in order to minimize accidental distractions during the presentations, we have disabled your ability to unmute yourself during the program. We've also disabled the chat to avoid some of those side conversations that can take our focus away from our speakers. You will be able to send chat messages privately to myself and to Marluce in case you have any technical difficulties or other questions. We've allotted about 10 minutes for Q&A after each of our presentations today. And there will also be time to ask questions during the panel discussion at the end. To ask a question, we ask that you use the hand raise function, which is located in the bar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And for many users, you may need to click on the reactions icon in order to locate the hand raise function. So clicking on raise hand will bump up your Zoom square to the top of the screen, so we'll be able to see you, and we'll individually unmute you and call on you in the order that we see you on the screen to ask your question. Alternatively, you can also place a question in the chat, and our speakers will answer them as they are able. And again, those will be visible only to the meeting's hosts and co-hosts. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again, and we'll get started with our virtual tour of the exhibition. Give me 1 second. Right. Hopefully that is visible to everyone. So as I walk you virtually through our exhibition, Swing Landscape, Stuart Davis and the Modernist Mural, I'm going to show you a number of installation photos to give you a feel for the exhibition's physical layout. I'll also touch on specific works in a little more detail, so you may see those individually pulled out, as we see here with Swing Landscape itself. As I mentioned earlier, the exhibition contains 42 works of art, most of which are loans to the museum. Several historical exhibition catalogs, books, and ephemera add additional context, as do the photo murals you'll see installed throughout the space. These are enlarged from archival photos I discovered in the course of my research. Swing Landscape itself, let's go back here for a second. Swing Landscape is installed in a central location within the exhibition space, signaling its place at the center of this research project. And the exhibition layout, again, revolves around and connects back to the mural. This photo that you see on the left shows the finished mural in conjunction with 3 of the studies that Stuart Davis produced between 1936 and 1938 as he conceptualized and worked on this project. And you can see at the right, one of his earliest studies from 1936, which is really wonderful because it helps us to see how Davis was envisioning this mural within an architectural space, thinking about the layout and the scale of the mural. Now, a common statement found in the literature on Davis is that working on such a large scale allowed him the freedom to experiment and innovate as an artist. While this is true, it's also important to remember that he did not have complete artistic freedom. All WPA muralists were required to submit a series of studies in a variety of media to FAP administrators and representatives of the site where the mural was to be installed. Studies could be rejected at any time during this process, and many mural designs were never realized or brought to completion. These studies in this exhibition for Swing Landscape offer insight into Davis's working process, but also help tell the story of the mural's origins as an FAP assignment. As I mentioned previously, Swing Landscape was supposed to be installed in the Williamsburg houses in Brooklyn, New York. A shortage of affordable housing, exacerbated by the Great Depression, led to the establishment of the Public Works Administration, or PWA, as well as the New York City Housing Authority in 1933 and 1934, respectively. It was under the auspices of these agencies that the Williamsburg houses and similar residential developments were constructed in the 1930s. And you can see here in this slide, a blueprint or site plan for the Williamsburg houses, showing a sense of giving you a sense of the scale of this development. It takes up about 20 square blocks, and there was tenement housing previously in this location that was torn down in order for the Williamsburg houses to be constructed. Now this housing project was modeled on initiatives in post-World War I Europe, in which local governments and labor unions sponsored the construction of mass urban housing for the working classes, frequently hiring modernist architects to design these sites. I'm just showing you two examples here from Vienna and Berlin. I think the example from Berlin is especially pertinent. I think we can clearly see the aesthetic similarities between this site designed by the German architect Bruno Taut and the Williamsburg houses, which were designed by William Lescaz, a Swiss-born architect. Okay, back to the exhibition. In addition to its modernist architectural style, the Williamsburg housing project was distinguished by an ambitious public art program, which was to include 17 murals by 12 painters and a series of carved relief sculptures. As part of my exhibition project, I've reconstructed this public art program to the best of my ability. The catalog includes images of all the preliminary studies and finished works of art that I was able to locate, about 60 in total, 60 images. I discovered and identified several of these in the course of my research, but there are likely many more mural studies still out there waiting to be properly identified. You see here on the left, several mural studies in the exhibition. These are by Ilya Balatowski and Albert Swindon. And on the right, they're a little hard to make out in this installation photo, but these are studies by George Mcneill and Harry Bowden. It's probable that these names are new to you. And one of the joys of my research was rediscovering and learning more about the many artists who greatly contributed to American modernism, but have unfairly fallen out of the canon. And hopefully they'll continue to be rediscovered and retake their rightful place in the art historical narrative. So unfortunately, the Williamsburg Public Art Program was never fully realized. Ultimately, only 5 murals by 4 artists were actually installed when construction on the housing project was completed in 1938. You can see in this slide the murals that were eventually installed in the archival photos showing 2 murals in situ. These are by the German-born artist Paul Kelpe. Moving around the screen clockwise, we have at the top the mural by Ilya Balatowski, and then Albert Swindon and Balcom Green. So these were all installed. And so this brings us to the question of why Swing Landscape, despite being completed, was apparently rejected by its patrons. Having scoured all of the relevant archives, at least I think, I feel confident in saying that no extant documentation provides a definitive answer to this question. But I think all we really need to do is compare Swing Landscape with these murals that made the final cut in order to learn why Swing Landscape was not installed. And so here we can see Swing Landscape in conjunction with the murals by Balatowski and Swindon. Those 2 murals nicely conform to the FAP director Holger Cahill's definition of mural painting, as he wrote in 1936. The color, the scale, and the character of the painting must have clarity, largeness, carrying power, and a rhythmic order that leads the eye easily through the whole space. Mural art is suited to large, simple forms, and its color schemes are much more severely limited than those of the easel painter. So compare that definition to the description of swing landscape offered by the New York Times art critic in 1938, when the mural was displayed at the FAP's art gallery. So the New York Times critic, Edward Alden Jewell, had this to say about swing landscape. The color shrieks as if stricken with pain that cannot be less than acute. So he wasn't so sure about it. And quite simply, swing landscape was not deemed successful as a mural for a streamlined, Bauhaus-inspired architectural space. Now, the exhibition also examines swing landscape's relationship to Stuart Davis's own oeuvre of the 1930s. The mural presents us with an abstracted view of the waterfront of Gloucester, Massachusetts, where Davis spent many of his summers beginning in 1915. The Gloucester landscape served as his primary subject during the 1930s. And as we see in the two paintings that I'm highlighting here, Landscape with Drying Sails and The Red Cart from 1931 and 32, Davis established a basic compositional structure and a repertoire of nautical imagery, and this appears throughout his Gloucester oeuvre. Through these works, we can see how Davis's approach became more and more abstracted throughout the 1930s, culminating in swing landscape. Yet many have been perplexed at Davis's choice of the Gloucester waterfront for a mural intended for residents of a New York City housing project. Why not pick a subject that residents could more easily relate to? I discovered one compelling answer in the archives. As it turns out, the Williamsburg mural project patrons did not want imagery that reflected the residents' daily lives, but rather sought out an aesthetic that would broaden their horizons. Burgoyne Diller, the head of the FAP's mural division, argued that after an 8-hour factory shift, the Williamsburg tenants would find painted images of more machines, quote, neither interesting nor stimulating. He instead advocated for abstract murals, believing that they would stimulate relaxation while also complementing the site's architecture. Yet what Davis presents us with in Swing Landscape is far from a relaxing aesthetic vision. Comparing Swing Landscape to several works by Fernand Léger, including his painting The City and his studies for a cinematic mural, which referenced New York Harbor, these allow us to identify an urban sensibility in Davis's mural. Davis often tried to evoke the feeling of modern urban life in his work. Swing Landscape's visual affinity with the rhythms and energy of swing music is often commented upon, but its visual complexity and brilliant vitality also evoke the sensory stimulation of modern life more broadly, hinting at the modern city's electric lights, advertising billboards, and fast-moving traffic. Davis was, in fact, quite explicit about aligning his own aesthetic with the experience of modernity. In 1940, he wrote the following: "An artist who has traveled on a steam train, driven an automobile, or flown in an airplane doesn't feel the same way about form and space as one who has not. An artist who has used a telegraph, telephone, and radio doesn't feel the same way about time and space as one who has not. And an artist who lives in a world of motion pictures, electricity, and synthetic chemistry doesn't feel the same way about light and color as one who has not." In expressing these sentiments, Davis was closely aligned with Fernand Léger, whom he knew personally, and who advocated for new artistic approaches that expressed modernity through form and color. And like Davis, Léger saw the value of taking art out of museums and bringing it into public spaces, where it would become part of the urban and residential landscape. So in order to emphasize Léger's strong influence on Davis, and more generally on American mural painting in this era, The exhibition includes two of his so-called mural paintings of the mid-1920s. These were made for specific architectural spaces. And we also have four of his cinematic mural studies. And these were produced for an unrealized mural that he was designing for Rockefeller Center. And it was a mural that literally would have moved and been rather cinematic in its presentation. So with this, we can turn to the third context in which I wanted to situate swing landscape in the exhibition. And that is its relationship to the phenomenon of abstract mural painting in the 1930s. Swing landscape and the other Williamsburg murals were produced at a time when mural painting was experiencing a renaissance and revitalization. The Mexican mural movement, for example, was extremely influential in the US, and the government was allocating funding for public art, something nearly unprecedented. However, most of the murals we're familiar with from this era are figurative, painted in traditional realist styles and containing fairly overt social or political messages. Only about 40 abstract murals were produced under the auspices of the FAP, mostly for sites in and around New York City. The Williamsburg murals were the only abstract murals painted for a residential site. The others were produced for sites generally with technological or medical functions, including Newark Airport, radio station WNYC, and the Hospital for Chronic Diseases on Roosevelt Island. The exhibition here includes mural studies for all of these sites by a range of artists, including Arshile Gorky, Lee Krasner, Rosalind Bengalsdorf Brown, and Ilya Balatowski. And you can see those in these two installation shots, as well as some ephemera that we have in the exhibition. So as we see here in Balatowski's easel scale study for the mural he contributed to the Hall of Medical Sciences at the New York World's Fair of 1939, and we see that both in the installation shot, and I've also pulled it out. I wanted to highlight this one to talk about a little bit about the connection between abstraction and medicine, which I found very interesting when I embarked on this research. And I wondered why that was. But if you recall, one argument for placing abstract murals in the Williamsburg houses was that their colors and forms would be relaxing and therapeutic, offering residents an antidote to the stresses of their daily lives. And those same arguments convinced doctors and hospital administrators to approve abstract murals for their facilities as well. However, swing landscape is far from relaxing, and this offers us quite a different perspective on the meaning of abstract or perhaps quasi-abstract mural painting. Through the exhibition, reconnecting swing landscape with its intended location in a public housing project, I think this allows us to better appreciate the mural's social and political resonance. Through the exhibition, I argue that Stuart Davis's commitment to anti-fascism, his progressive political activism, and his advocacy for bringing art to the people through the medium of public art informed his approach to painting his Williamsburg mural and imbues swing landscape with multiple layers of meaning. The exhibition catalog, by the way, explores the mural's intersections with the politics of its time in greater detail. And Marluz, perhaps you could put that link in the chat one more time. So I'm going to conclude this tour, so to speak, right now. And we have a little bit of time, so I'm happy to take any questions. And again, if you can use that hand raised function if you have a question. Maybe I'll stop the share in the meantime. Okay, I see a question from Greta, so I'm going to ask you to unmute, Greta.
Just wondering if you have any idea of how the Williamsburg mural swing landscape came to University of Indiana?
Yes, I can definitely talk to you about that. So the after the mural was rejected from the Williamsburg site at some point in 1938, early 1938, it was displayed, as I mentioned, at an exhibition at the Federal Art Projects Gallery in New York. That was in May of 1938. After that exhibition closed, it appears that the mural went into storage for several years, probably in New York. And I don't think it was seen again in public until 1941, when it was sent out to Cincinnati for an exhibition at the Cincinnati Modern Art Society. And it was like a dual retrospective for Stuart Davis and Marsden Hartley. Now, Cincinnati, it's about a 3-hour drive from Bloomington, so it's not too far from us. We had a brand new chair of our art department at that time. His name was Henry Hope. He had just started, and he got wind of the fact through actually a student of his that there was this really spectacular mural by Stuart Davis in the show in Cincinnati that was homeless. And what this led to was that he actually brought the exhibition to Indiana University in the fall of 1941, actually did not bring swing landscape because of the size of the mural, and we didn't have an adequate place to display it at the time. But that didn't stop him. So we had, most of the exhibition came here, and then he opened up negotiations with the administrators of the WPA and with Stuart Davis himself, and he said, so hello, we are a tax-supported public university. We would be eligible to receive some WPA art. Would you consider placing this mural, which evidently has no home, with us? And so there were a few months of negotiations, and they agreed. And so the mural was sent here in as I said, February of 1942. And so we didn't really have a museum space at the time, but they found places around campus to install the mural for about 20 years. It moved from place to place, and then eventually in the 60s, it found its permanent home in the museum space. So I see a question from Tina has a question. I'm going to ask you to unmute, Tina.
Yeah, what's the difference between a mural and a painting?
Well, I think most simply, a mural is a painting that's meant to be, well, I was going to say it's meant to be on the wall, but so are paintings. So a mural is typically a larger scale painting, often painted directly on the wall. If you're familiar with the fresco technique, those are murals in which the paint is actually applied to wet plaster and becomes part of the wall. What you might notice with swing landscape is that it's an oil on canvas painting, a very large scale oil on canvas painting. This was typical for WPA murals. A lot of them were what was termed portable murals. So they could be painted in an artist's studio rather than on site. And they would just be rolled up and moved from place to place. Now, I believe swing landscape, had it been installed in the Williamsburg houses, it would have been adhered to the wall with some kind of an adhesive and not shown with a frame. So it would have appeared to be, more, like as part of the wall. Does that help? Okay, so I'm going to ask. I see we have a question from David.
Yeah. Well, Jenny, thank you. It's not so much of a question, but at around the same time that Hope identified the Stuart Davis mural, the university was also in the process of installing a major group of murals by another artist. Would you mind recounting for those amongst us who aren't aware of those murals what that was?
Sure, thank you, David, for that. So Indiana University is also home to a series of murals by Stuart Davis's nemesis, Thomas Hart Benton. The two were not particularly close friends. They were a little bit at opposite ends of the spectrum artistically and also politically. But what is fascinating is that in the 30s and into the early 40s, Indiana University was just acquiring all these murals, it seems, right and left. So we have located in different buildings on our campus, Thomas Hart Benton's series of murals about the history of the state of Indiana. Those were painted, they're not WPA murals, they were painted in 1933 for the Century of Progress World's Fair in Chicago, and they would have been for the Indiana Pavilion. So somewhat similar to Swing Landscape, those murals after the fair closed, there wasn't an obvious home for those murals. There wasn't a clear place to send them. Again, I believe they languished in a storage facility for a little while, and I don't have the precise year in my head that we acquired them, but let's say around 1940. So I use President, who was a man by the name of Herman B. Wells. Similar to Henry Hope, he found out these murals needed a place to live, and we were in the process of constructing some new buildings on campus, an academic building, a theater, an auditorium, and they had large spaces that could accommodate those murals. So those were brought here as well shortly before Swing Landscape. And so actually, this is a great campus to spend some time on if you're interested in the history of American mural painting and in looking at some very different approaches to muralism at that time. Okay, I'm going to call on Karen. You should be able to unmute now.
Yes.
Okay.
You mentioned the Mexican muralists whom Davis disliked incredibly. I mean, he approved of their politics, he approved of the idea, but he wrestled with trying to like the work and ended up not able to convince himself. He found it very reactionary. He was particularly irritated at Rivera, who had started out as a cubist and he said should have known better. And of course, this is, he later said, the only successful, he just never found this acceptable. So he was certainly not going to do anything that was related to that. But I'm curious that you didn't mention Davis's own mural for the World's Fair for the history of transportation building, which is figurative. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so I didn't include that, or I wasn't able to locate any studies for that I could include in the exhibition.
No, I know there are no studies for it, but it certainly was something that preoccupied him and was contemporary with what other people were doing.
Right. So yes, that mural is figurative in a sense. Maybe we should say representational. For those of you not familiar with it, it's a black and white mural. And it does portray imagery related to modern, technology, communications. I would say it's pretty far removed from the Mexican muralists aesthetically. Definitely. I think Davis had a much different sense about what representationalism could be. It's very stylized. I mean, Swing Landscape itself is not really quite accurate for me to even call it abstract, because we can see some forms that are identifiable in our mural. Davis was, he was not interested in what the Mexican muralists were doing, despite their influence in the US more generally. He was also not interested in what many other abstract muralists were doing in pursuing non-objectivity. He always wanted his work to have some relationship to everyday life, to the physical world, and he tried to do that through stylizing forms, so he could pursue an avant-garde mode of expression, but still keep a connection with the physical reality. Thank you for your question or comment. Greta, I see if you're another question, so.
Yes, I just wanted to comment additionally that a mural, which I will discuss briefly in a little bit, by James Brooks at LaGuardia Airport at the Marine Terminal, wrestled with those ideas that Davis did. And he tried to incorporate Mexican type things, but really used it to experiment with quote unquote abstract forms. And you'll see that. And I think there's some sort of correlation between that and what Davis did, although they don't look the same way. It's a similar sort of quandary.
Great. Thank you. I look forward to hearing more about that. And David.
Jenny, this is more of a question. So it seems to me that the style of mural painting exemplified by Thomas Hart Benton is also deeply connected with and associated with the Midwest, which we are firmly located within. And abstract mural painting, it seems to me, has a more of a connection to the city and perhaps to the coasts. And I wondered if you had discovered any abstract murals that were painted in the Midwest, that originated in the Midwest. And if you had, what are they and where are they?
Meaning in the 30s.
Correct.
Well, that was it's a little bit beyond the scope of the research that I was conducting for this project, because I was really focusing on the Williamsburg mural project. I think in the 30s, though, from what I was able to discover, the abstract murals that were produced at that time really did concentrate in and around New York City. So no, even though I wasn't specifically looking to see if there were any in the Midwest, that was what came to light, is that all of these studies, all of the finished murals I was finding really in the New York City area. I think it was primarily due to the influence of the artist who was in charge of the FAP's mural division in New York, Burgoyne Diller, who was an abstract painter, who was kind of a follower of Mondrian. And he was very instrumental in securing some of these commissions for abstract muralists. But again, that was just in New York. One thing that is interesting, though, is that if we jump ahead a couple of decades, I think 1955, I think is the year Stuart Davis painted an abstract, very abstract, non-objective mural for Drake University in Iowa. So it's not quite the time
Just
period.
to interrupt for a second, I'm going to show that in my talk.
Oh, wonderful. So we'll get to see that. But that's, I think, shows how the popularity or influence of abstraction did start to spread throughout the country. And Jody.
Thank you, Jenny. Just a quick sort of comment. So I'm a recent resident moving to the Midwest, and though COVID has sort of stopped my adventures and discoveries here, I have been delighted to learn very recently that Cleveland was a real hub for WPA, and in fact, rather than East Coast artists like Davis going out to Des Moines or sort of migrating abstraction east, there actually was quite a lot of interesting, advanced, formally sophisticated work going on in Cleveland. And that's something, I don't know if others have stumbled upon this, but it's certainly something that I think is ripe for more scholarship and more attention.
Wow. Thank you, Jody. That's really fascinating. I hope someone will take that up. So I want to thank everyone for all of your questions. And at this point, I'd like to change gears and move on to our first guest speaker. Greta, are you ready for your talk? Okay, so I'm going to introduce our first speaker now, Dr. Greta Berman. So Greta Berman received a BA from Antioch College, an MA from the University of Stockholm, and a PhD from Columbia University. She has been professor of art history at Juilliard since 1978. In addition to writing a monthly column, Focus on Art, for the Juilliard Journal, she co-curated and co-edited Synesthesia, Art and the Mind. She has published numerous articles, as well as lectured on synesthesia and other subjects. Her doctoral dissertation, titled The Lost Years, Mural Painting in New York City, under the Works Progress Administration's Federal Art Project, 1935 to 1943, was published by Garland Press in 1978. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Greta.
First of all, I want to thank Jenny McComas and the university and all the people who are responsible for this. Secondly, I want to dedicate my talk to the memory of Francis V. O'Connor, who was the real pioneer in New Deal studies, my mentor and my friend. And to friends who I noticed on the participant list, whom I haven't seen in years or maybe even decades. I'm thrilled. So in my abstract, I wrote, few critics and even fewer members of the public appreciated the innovative ideas of the abstract artists in the United States. However, in 1937, Burgoyne Diller, the director of the mural project of the WPA, himself an abstract artist, commissioned paintings from several relatively unknown artists for the Williamsburg housing project. This is the story of their genesis, their later neglect, and their subsequent rediscovery. When I wrote my PhD dissertation, published in 1975, it is so hard for me to believe that that's nearly half a century ago. I was criticized for using the word muralism. One of my readers underlined it and said, "A word?" ? Everywhere now I read muralism, so I'm not sure whether I invented it or my reader was wrong that it was a word, but it certainly is now. During the 30s, there were relatively few abstract artists and few places to show abstract art. And what you all need to realize is that the mural division was just one part of the WPA FAP, but it stood out as the most visible part. Everybody saw these murals, or at least they appeared in public places. It doesn't mean people looked at them necessarily. Several artists, one of the reasons I wrote my dissertation when I did was that I wanted to speak to artists who were still alive and get their insights, which I did. I spoke to Ilya Balatowski at length, to James Brooks at length, to Rosalind Bengalsdorf Brown. They all gave huge credit to Burgoyne Diller. Brown stated in 1972, credit should really go to one man who almost single-handedly achieved the first public recognition and dissemination of abstract art in New York City. Burgoyne Diller, head of the WPA FAP from its inception until the early 1940s, He encouraged and expedited transfers of abstract artists to the mural division, gathering them, so to speak, under his wing. And Balatowski in 1974 reiterated what she said, saying, "I don't think people realize that Diller was instrumental in something historic. Not only was he dedicated," and now I'm paraphrasing, to abstract art, but he actually sought out abstract artists to do it. So let me start showing you some of the slides here. This, by the way, I should put into the chat. I'll do it later on because I don't want to take up the time. It's, and you can find it if you look it up, is a short video, a little too long to show right now, that the New York City Housing Authority made about the restoration of the murals. So these were the Williamsburg houses made in 1936, dedicated to wiping out the slums and providing housing for people who had previously lived in very tight and awful headquarters. You will be seeing some of these over again, and I'll try not to repeat everything that Jenny so beautifully just said, though I have some quotes that I may want to reiterate. This was a study that Ilya Balatowski made for the Williamsburg housing projects, which was installed. However, when I went to look at it, this is what it looked like in the 1970s. It was on the wall. You can see the forms bleeding through underneath. Whole thing was deteriorated, and graffiti was up there. Me the yaya. By the way, I looked up what yaya means, and it's a sort of derogatory slang word. So back to the houses, you'll also see them sometimes called the Ten Eyck buildings, the Williamsburg houses. And this shows an aerial view with this schism beyond all of the tight tenements here. And it covered 23 acres. So this is a mural by Philip Evergood, who was more in the WPA sort of style that we think about. He did this for the Richmond Hill Public Library. And the reason is that it shows the building of a housing project, or at least of people moving out to the suburbs. And it shows how miserable they were in the city and how happy they are in the country. However, as Jenny also said, all of these murals needed to be approved by many different people. And the local supervisor hated this mural, calling it a bunch of Russian peasants. One minister objected to the emphasis on mammary glands. You can see people's bodies underneath their clothing. And it is said that this person over here was one of the board members who disapproved. So that could also lead to its not being so happy. This, again, a very sort of typical social realist painting. This is the other half of the Evergood, showing life in the city, the difficulties of it, how hard it is for people to see these things. I just wanted to show you this person wiping a tear out of his eye, people with axes and pickaxes and the whole view. I mean, we're all kind of familiar with this. Evergood at one point wrote something saying, "Sure, I'm a realist artist or a social realist artist." Of course, everybody was influenced by Diego Rivera, whether they liked him or not. Numbers of the artists I interviewed alluded to having climbed up the scaffold while Diego was working on this mural. He did it in around 1933, and originally it was called Man at the Crossroads, but changed to Man, Controller of the Universe when it was destroyed. And this was a fresco. It was part of the wall, so it was actually chipped off the wall and destroyed. Everybody says it was because of this portrait of Lenin, but in fact, the whole thing is an ode to communism on this side, with the flag of the Internationale here by various Marxist leaders of the world, a decapitated Nazi statue with the workers sitting on its head, as opposed, oh, and here is the infamous Lenin, as opposed to the capitalists, including Rockefeller himself, with a bunch of germs on top of his head, by the way, and people that are warlike and rioting in the streets. This is a painting by Moses Sawyer, which shows you how people worked on the WPA, people sitting around. It's a very nice painting. This is not a mural painting, but it shows people working on these sort of portable murals. A typical mural, again, by a man called Lucien Larbeau, which is in San Francisco, which shows you what people think of as WPA style. So I mentioned to you before the James Brooks mural. This is a gigantic mural that James Brooks painted in 1940 called The History of Flight. I interviewed Brooks at length about this mural. And in the 1970s, if you had gone to see it, you would have seen nothing of this. The wall was a sort of bluish gray, horrible color, no mural. This is a detail of the mural, and it shows Brooks, as I said, in this sort of quandary between Mexican mural painting, very influenced by Rivera, and modernism that he sort of sneaked in the guise of planes and different kinds of plans and so on. So what he wanted to do was this, but he felt compelled to do this, and it was a kind of compromise. Years later, I don't know if I was responsible, but perhaps I and some other people wrote about this mural, publicized it, and lo and behold, the whole thing was restored. Ironically, it could be restored because it was done in a sort of rubber-based paint covered over with layers of oil paint, and they were able to remove them. So if you go to LaGuardia Airport, to that round Art Deco building called the Marine Air Terminal, you will see this gorgeous painting. And just to show you what Davis did later on, this is a 1946 painting by Davis, which is just called Composition, and you can see that's where he was going with it. Which will be discussed and never discussed enough. I have to say, when I first saw this, I misunderstood it. I thought that swing landscape, and I wrote this in my dissertation, referred to swings in the playground. It doesn't. It refers specifically, as Jenny said, to the Gloucester harbor, but there are allusions to many other things, as well as I believe one of our speakers is going to talk about the pun on swing music. Here's one of the studies that's in the Smithsonian. He made many studies, spent over 2 years working on this mural. And as was already said, this was an important influence and a major abstract mural of that time. Another study for it, you can see kind of how he worked. This one is in Washington, D.C. And here are some other paintings, easel paintings, that give you some of the elements of Gloucester or of New York Harbor or waterfront scenes. You can see how they all kind of come together. This will be talked about more, but I wanted to give you the full quote that Edward Alden Jewell said about this painting. He said it screams and needs a whole room or even entire housing project to itself. Set up as a signboard message to Mars on Mount Everest, it could decoy the cotillion of the spangled firmament. But woe betide him who would spread it as a net beneath the flying trapeze. And this was not intended as praise. However, it does literally praise Davis's work to the skies. It, of course, exemplifies Davis's solution to a mural problem, as we've said and will be said more. It's abstract, but not completely non-representational, very influenced by Europeans. Davis was famous for saying, in America, we're all French American, Russian American, African American, German American. Why not be Rembrandt American, Picasso American, Leger American? So this mural, as we have already pointed out, looked quite different from the other murals that were accepted at Williamsburg. This is the mural that Davis did for radio station WNYC. This is on long-term loan to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, so anybody going to the Met can see this in the American wing. Here he uses elements from a radio studio, musical notes, wires, ladders, and so on. And actually, Burgoyne Diller kind of defended showing abstraction at a time that people didn't understand it by saying, in the case of Williamsburg, as Jenny said earlier, he felt, and this was Diller's way of getting this accepted. He said, well, people aren't going to want to look at factories after working all day in factories. They want something relaxing and something they will enjoy looking at. I was asked at one point, do you think people really looked at them? And I don't think they really did, because my experience in doing research on the WPA was I would call people, I would try to find out if there were murals, and they would say, what mural? And I would say, would you please look up from your chair on the wall behind you? And they would say, oh, that. So the defense for this mural and others in the radio station was, well, people don't want to be distracted in a radio station by realistic images. They want something that is suggestive, that is, again, entertaining, that doesn't take away from. I mentioned to you the mural that Stuart Davis did for Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa. This is where he was going. And here's an in situ view, so you get a sense of how big it is and what Davis eventually did. So back to a study for Ilya Balatowski's mural. And here the entire mural. I wanted to bring this up to date since I did my work half a century ago. Still can't believe that. And show you a work by somebody who let me just do this for a second. Her name is and she had come to the Brooklyn Museum, which has the restored murals on exhibit, was so inspired by them that she made a tapestry or several tapestries and hung them around the Williamsburg project, which still exists. Here you can see it next to the Balatowski mural. And to remind you, this is what it looked like when I first saw it in about 1975 or so. And here it is today. As I said, I wanted to bring this up to date, so I went to the Brooklyn Museum to look at it a few days ago, and there I am pointing at it, and you can see the mural under plexiglass, beautifully restored. Unfortunately, though, it's in a cafeteria area where people seem to pass by without really noticing it. Here's Ilya Balatowski at the time that he made this mural. This is one that he did a bit later on that was a design for another mural. And where Ilya Balatowski went eventually, well, before that, he did designs for, Jenny mentioned the chronic disease hospital on what was then called Welfare Island, now it's Roosevelt Island. These were some of the designs for those. And this is where Balatowski eventually went. It's so interesting to me to see how James Brooks went from his experiments to his more pure abstraction, how we saw Davis did, and now we see Balatowski. These murals were experimental, they were new, they were a way that the artist could really try their hands to reach the maturity that they finally did. So this is Balcom Green's work that was installed, and you can see the difference. This is indeed architectural decoration and could be perceived as relaxing and kind of gentle and does not distract from the place. And here I am again a few days ago at the Brooklyn Museum, and you can see how it's installed there. Another work by Balcom Green we see here, and another one here, just to show you how his work related to that other one. So the artist Paul Kelpe, German-born, did these kind of almost precisionist paintings that look a little close to Sheeler and some of the precisionist artists. But for his mural at the Williamsburg, he actually did two that are very Picasso influenced, very non-objective. He and a lot of these artists were original members of the American Abstract Artists group, very influenced by European work. So this one and this one were both found in the 1980s under grime and filing cabinets and falling apart, and very, very beautifully restored. Unfortunately, I couldn't find these two at Brooklyn the other day, so I think they must be in storage. And this is the Albert Swindon, which also was installed, and again has a more, if you will, relaxing quality than swing landscape. And this is Mildred, I'll give you the name again so you can see it, Mildred Beltre's work that was inspired by this and inspired by a poster for housing from the WPA saying, "Must we always have this? Cats and ashcans," like the Ashcan school actually. "Why not housing?" So here you can see her mural inspired by that mural, which she saw at the Brooklyn Museum. I thought it might be nice for you to see a couple of Burgoyne Diller's works. So this is what Diller did at the time that he was helping and recruiting these artists and really getting them jobs and getting them accepted. Another of Diller's work, very close to what Balatowski was doing, and certainly both of them disciples of Mondrian. This is one that did not get approved also by a man called Francis Criss, and it's what I referred to in my dissertation as semi-abstract, which you could also talk about the Brooks a little bit like that, and also comes out of precisionism, but has a more quirky sort of fun aspect with some things that are not quite real. Somewhere, I would say, between realism, Stuart Davis, and more actual abstract work. And the last few works that I'm going to show you are some studies, which I believe some of these are in the exhibition. I have not been there myself. I hope to go. And this is from a show in 2018 of some of Lee Krasner's work. She actually took over from de Kooning because de Kooning got kicked off the project because of his alien status. You had to be an American citizen. And she spoke to me a bit about these, and you can see that they're kind of in the same vein as some of the Balatowski and some of the other murals done for Williamsburg. These only exist as studies. Here's another one a little bit closer, maybe to Swindon and Balatowski. And lastly, Rosalind Bengalsdorf, who later married Byron Brown, faced many difficulties for the fifth floor living room of the nurses' residence in that chronic disease hospital. And she redid it and made it more realistic, showing some actual musical instruments. And I've seen conflicting reports, so I'd be interested if anybody knows for sure. One that said it never was approved and one that said that it was eventually. So that's what I've got for you today. I'm going to stop the share of the screen, I hope, if I can. Oh, I need to end the show first. And then I need to stop the share. And I would like to, as I said, welcome some of the distinguished people who've joined us and open the floor for questions. And what happened to me? I went away.
Thank you so much, Greta. That was really fascinating. Yeah, we stopped. I think you froze a little. We could hear you and see your slides, but your own, maybe try turning your video back on.
That's what I'm trying to do, yeah. Here I am.
There you are.
Okay.
Great. Yeah, I think we're all used to these Zoom issues by now.
Oh yeah,
but
absolutely.
Yeah, no problem. So I could moderate some questions. So again, please go ahead, and if you have something you would like to ask Greta, just raise your hand with that icon. So I'll start with Maureen. I'm going to ask you to unmute. Okay, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Maureen O'Brien, Rhode Island School of Design. Greta, thank you so much. I wondered if you could tell us, and thank you for introducing James Brooks into this conversation today. I wonder if you could tell us if there's evidence of other murals painted by James Brooks.
I don't know of any. I did talk to him at great length, and he, by the way, was very proud of that mural and was instrumental in getting it restored. So he didn't disown it as some people did who went on to do other things, because as you may recall, Arshil Gorky referred to WPA work as poor art for poor people. So some people didn't want to be associated with that. But the short answer is I don't know of any. It's possible, but I don't know.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Greta? Well, I'll just ask you a quick question, or maybe it's not a quick question. Could you tell us a little bit about what alerted you to some of these murals to begin with? I'm thinking, the Williamsburg murals that were painted over. What led you to aid in their rediscovery? How did you know how to find them?
Thank you for asking that. I meant to say it in the beginning of my talk, and I don't like reading talks, so I then leave things out sometimes. I was writing my dissertation about mural painting in the WPA in New York City because nobody had really done that. They had talked about the New Deal, the WPA, the generalities, but not looked at the specific works. So I took it as a task to catalog all. And in order to do that, I had to go to the archives in City Hall. There was the archives of the New York City Art Commission. So everything that was proposed had to be shown to the New York City Art Commission. I believe they've renovated it and made it nice, but when I was there, it was an attic, very hot, up in the top of City Hall. And the things that I looked at sort of crumbled under my fingers as I looked at these archival things. They were so old, nobody had looked at them. And I came across these photographs and I said, could these be WPA murals? They look so un-WPA. And that's what alerted me. I said, oh, and then I looked at the correspondence. Had written to the Art Commission, and there was a lot of correspondence, a lot of photographs, and many, many sketches and studies, at which point I got somebody from the New York City Housing Authority to go with me to the housing project to look for some of these murals. The only one we found was the Balatowski that had the graffiti over it. But a few years later, Nancy Troy wrote a dissertation on the Williamsburg project, and she came to see me and we talked about it. And I then lost contact and so on, but I believe she was responsible for finding additional ones. And in that video that I mentioned, you can find it. I didn't put it into the chat, but you can find it under Williamsburg Murals video done by the New York City Housing Authority. They show how these were painstakingly restored during the 1980s and then eventually put into the Brooklyn Museum. Thanks for that question.
Thank you so much for giving us some more background about that. So Thomas Cabanese, I hope I'm not mispronouncing that, has a question. I'm going to ask, do you want to say that question out loud? I'll ask you to unmute. You should be able to unmute now.
Oh, yes, I can, yes. I am a colleague of Greta's here at the Juilliard School and a regular weekly lunch partner. And Greta, just so great to hear everything about, the abstract mural work. I've heard you talk about it, but there's so much more detail, so thank you. I am also, in addition to the work that I do here, I'm a teaching artist and I work in public schools often. And I just have seen a lot of mural works in public schools. And, in various, like the way you're presenting it, in various states, some beautiful as if they'd been done yesterday, some covered over, some disintegrated. And I wonder, are people working on that? Are they thinking about looking at murals in places like public schools as well as housing developments?
Absolutely. There's a relatively new organization, and I can't recall the name of it. Maybe somebody here knows, examining the New Deal. I stumbled on it, and a lot of them have been cataloged. So I'm really glad you noticed them, because that's what my dissertation was about. I just focused this talk on Williamsburg, but there was, for example, a wonderful mural done by Lucien Bloch at George Washington High School up in the Bronx, which was the history of music. And Lucien Bloch was the daughter of Ernest Bloch, the composer. So she knew about music, and she did this incredible fresco, which during the summer, when she was working on it, the principal decided was no good and covered over, got rid of it. And then she got other people to join her and redid the whole thing, which now, at least when I last was there, exists. Many in schools, as you said, in various states. And I'm not sure about, each one. There are also some really controversial ones in San Francisco that we've been reading about, where they show enslaved people picking cotton, and George Washington having enslaved people working for him, and so on. And should those be or should those not be? And that's worth a whole symposium in itself.
I just want to follow up on what you said, Greta, because the Thomas Hart Benton murals that we have here at Indiana University also have a panel that's quite controversial, showing the Ku Klux Klan burning a cross, and it's in a classroom. So there's been a lot of controversy. A lot of students would prefer not to have classes in that particular room. It's actually a large lecture hall, and it's actually no longer used as a classroom for that reason. And so trying to find the balance about educating people about what is really happening in the mural. It's actually an anti-Klan message that Benton is putting forth, but when you just look at it on the surface, it's not an easy image to look at. So there are a lot of I think we have to assess.
Philip Guston, who, by the way, was also on the WPA, and another whole story, because Guston was somebody also who was conflicted between realism and abstraction. And in fact, that's his whole career, and started with the Ku Klux Klan. And that whole traveling Guston exhibit was tabled because people didn't want to see images of the Klan, even though, as you said, it was anti all of that. So it's a very interesting issue.
Yeah, and Thomas sent me a message in the chat pointing out that there are also a number of murals at Colorado College that depict Indigenous people in some problematic ways. So yeah, it's certainly an issue.
It's interesting because abstraction was, of course, a different kind of issue. It wasn't an issue of offending race or religion or politics, but in terms of people don't like things they don't understand. And having abstraction in the 1930s was offensive to some people because they didn't get it. And you still see people do that in museums and so on. But, and that, of course, gets into your whole wonderful discussion. I really do want to recommend Jenny's catalog, as well as Jody Patterson, who's also here, who's written about it, about the political implications of Davis and the stylistic change that is not against realism, as people have pitted it, but really part of that same idea of bringing art. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done art for the masses and art for public. So it is an attempt to reach out to people.
Okay, it looks like Charlotte has a question. Go ahead.
Hi, I was wondering if you could speak more about Willem de Kooning's involvement in the Williamsburg housing project, and also how he was able to pass on his work to Lee Krasner.
I don't know too much about it. I just remember speaking to her about it and her being happy to take over from him. He had started sketches and he was working on it, but he didn't complete them. And she completed some of them, but her works were never installed either. So I believe there is research available and probably can find it. It just was kind of beyond the scope of what I did.
Okay, and Buffalo Bro has a question. You can unmute, I think.
Yep, that's me. Thank you. Just a couple of thoughts here. That's my artist name. I'm Brother Mark Elder from DePaul University here in Chicago. Just to point out the notion of public art in public schools and even schools in general. I do a lot of outreach with that. And just as a showcase place, Lane Tech College Prep here in Chicago has many murals, indoor murals that you can easily get a tour of. And many of them go back before WPA days, and certainly they have some really great WPA pieces, number of pieces, and it's rather interesting that we get to see these things, and they're happy to anybody should just showing up even during a school day can get a tour. It's amazing as to that. As far as Benton being controversial, well, come on, he's part politician, let's be real. But thank you.
Could you put that into the chat, please? Some of us can save the chat because it would be really nice to take that tour if possible.
Oh yeah, Lane Tech, sure.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you.
put in the
Well,
chat.
all I
for me
can
and
do
I'll
is
read.
just, I don't have a web address for it, but you can certainly look up Lane Tech College Prep and go from there.
Is that LANE or?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you.
I'll put
Yeah.
something in the chat. Lane Tech College Prep, did you say?
Yes, ma'am.
So there's the name.
So, and yeah, I do a lot of murals here in Chicago myself. So, if you wanted a real tour of what Chicago has, let me know. I'm happy to reach out to anybody.
Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Are there any other questions for Greta at this time?
While we're waiting, I just wanted to comment again. Somebody asked the difference between paintings and murals in the beginning of of your talk, and mural simply is like from the Latin or the French wall, mural, M-U-R. So it can be done in multiple ways. It can be done in true fresco, where it's done into the plaster. It can be done in a kind of other fresco secco, where you just paint it over it. And it can, that it's then pasted or glued to the wall. There's a whole history of that with Harlem Hospital. I don't know if any of you know Harlem Hospital murals. That's another whole saga. But one reason for doing them not in situ is if you're doing them for school, a hospital, or something like that, it's very intrusive to be painting on the wall while these things are going on. So it's much easier to paint them in your studio and then affix them to the walls, but they all count as murals.
Thanks for that, Greta. Okay. So I think at this point, it's just about 11:30. So let's go ahead, and I'd really like to thank you again, Greta, for your presentation, and we had some excellent discussion. We're going to take